Picture this. You're sitting in a lawyer's office. The room smells like old wood and cold coffee. There are flowers on the table, white lilies, the kind people bring to funerals, and the lawyer is shuffling papers with the unhurried movements of a man who has delivered bad news so many times he no longer feels the weight of it. Your father just died. You've been grieving for 3 weeks, barely sleeping, barely eating, going through the motions of condolence cards and casseroles and phone calls you answer because you're supposed to, even when you have nothing to say. And now you're sitting in this room holding yourself together because you know that at the end of this reading there will be something. Not comfort, not a replacement for what you've lost, but something solid. Something your father left specifically for you, because he loved you and because you were there for every appointment, every difficult day, every moment the family needed someone steady, and that someone was always you. The lawyer clears his throat. He begins to read, and within 4 minutes, your entire world collapses, because the name on the will, attached to everything, the house and the accounts and the investments and 40 years of your father's life's work, is not yours, it's your brother's. And the expression on your brother's face as the lawyer reads it out, that small, controlled, carefully practiced expression that is almost but not quite a smile, tells you everything you need to know. He knew. He knew before you walked into this room. He knew before the funeral. He knew before your father drew his last breath. He planned this. That is where Elena Dawson's story begins. And before we go any further, this is not a simple story about money. This is a story about what happens when betrayal goes so deep, it changes the entire architecture of who you are. What happens when the person who was supposed to be your family becomes your enemy? What happens when justice and revenge start to look so similar, you can no longer tell them apart? And most of all, this is a story about the price. Because revenge always has one. And Elena is about to find out exactly what hers is. If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe and hit the bell because we do stories like this every single week. If you've been here before, you know the deal. We don't rush. We don't skip the good parts. We go all the way in. Get comfortable. We are just getting started. Let's talk about Elena. Elena Dawson is 34 years old. She is the kind of woman people describe, consistently and without originality, as the responsible one. The one who showed up. The one who drove her father to his medical appointments, learned to cook his cardiologist-prescribed meals, sat in hospital waiting rooms doing work on her laptop because life doesn't stop just because someone you love is sick. She is sharp, organized, a financial analyst at a mid-size firm, which tells you something about how her mind works. She sees patterns, she follows threads, she understands how money moves and where it goes, and what it means when it goes somewhere it shouldn't. She is not someone you want as an enemy. Henry Dawson is 31 years old. He is the kind of man people describe, consistently and with significant admiration, as charming. He has the particular gift of making whoever he's talking to feel like the most important person in the room. He remembers the names of people's children and pets, and the specific things those people mentioned wanting once, months ago, so that when he shows up with exactly the right bottle of wine or exactly the right book recommendation, it feels like magic rather than calculation. It is not magic. Henry Dawson has been calculating since he was old enough to understand that the world rewards certain performances. And the performance he's been giving for 31 years is the performance of a man who is lovable and harmless and just charming enough to make people want to help him. Their father, Robert Dawson, loved both his children. Elena believes this and will continue to believe it even after everything that happens in this story. But she also knows that Robert loved his children differently. Elena was the one he relied on. Henry was the one he delighted in. There is a difference between those two things, and that difference is the crack in the foundation that Henry, patient and deliberate as he always was, widened over years into something large enough to walk through. Their mother, Carol, is 62, lives in the family home 20 minutes outside the city, and has spent 30 years navigating the space between a husband who needed managing and children who needed moderating with the quiet competence of someone who has accepted this is simply her role. She loves her children. She is not equipped for what is about to happen to her family. She will try her best. Her best will not be enough. Let's go back to the room. The lawyer's name was Gerald Park. He had a firm handshake and reading glasses he took on and off too many times, and he read the will in the careful monotone of someone who has learned to deliver content without editorializing. Robert Dawson's estate, approximately $2.3 million in assets including the family home, investment portfolio, and personal accounts, was bequeathed in its entirety to Henry James Dawson, with the exception of a single bequest of $10,000 to Elena Marie Dawson, described as a token of love and gratitude for her years of dedication. A token. $10,000. A token. Elena sat very still while Gerald Park finished reading. She has described this moment as watching something from very far away, as if her body understood before her mind did that this was information too large to absorb in real time. Henry was speaking to Gerald Park in a low voice, something about timelines and asset transfer, and the white lilies were still white, and the coffee was still cold, and outside a car alarm was going off, and Elena was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, and the number $2.3 million floating through her head like a signal from another planet. Then Henry glanced at her, just briefly. The kind of glance that could, by a charitable observer, be read as concern. But Elena was not a charitable observer. She was a financial analyst with 34 years of knowing this particular face in all its variations, and what she read in that glance was not concern. It was assessment. He was checking to see how badly she was hurt. He was, she understood with absolute clarity, pleased with the answer. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She thanked Gerald Park for his time, a reflexive politeness she would later not be able to explain. She walked out of the office, down the corridor, out through the glass front door and onto the pavement in the gray October air. She stood there for 1 minute exactly. Then she took out her phone, opened the Notes app, and typed 4 words. I am taking everything. She went home. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table. And she started to plan. Before we get into what Elena did next, I want to ask you something. Because most people watching this have felt some version of this moment. Not necessarily about inheritance, maybe about a job you deserved and didn't get. A relationship where someone took more than they gave, a friendship where loyalty only ran one way, that moment where you realized the rules you'd been playing by weren't the rules everyone else was using. What did you do when that happened? Drop it in the comments. Because this story is about what happens when someone decides not to just absorb the hit and move on. And I want to know, would you have done the same thing? Stay with me, because what Elena does next is going to show you exactly what happens when revenge takes the wheel. Here is what most people do when something devastating happens to them. They grieve. They tell their friends. They go through the stages of disbelief and anger, and eventually, not always, not cleanly, but eventually, they arrive at some version of acceptance. They lower their sights. They tell themselves life isn't fair, that fairness is a concept invented by children, and the sooner you let go of it, the healthier you'll be. They move on. Elena did not do any of those things. Elena did the one thing she was actually built for. She opened a spreadsheet. Over the next 3 days, while the rest of the world believed she was at home grieving, which she was, but grief and strategy are not mutually exclusive, and Elena had always been capable of running parallel processes, she began to build a picture, not of what had been taken from her, of Henry, his life, his finances, his relationships, his business, the architecture of everything he had, because Elena knew something Henry may have slightly underestimated. She was better at this than he was. Henry was charming. Henry was a skilled manipulator of people's emotions, perceptions, loyalties, but Henry was not a details person. He thought in broad strokes and grand gestures. He was the kind of person who won the room, but sometimes missed the footnote, Elena was the footnote person, and footnotes, in her experience, were where the real information lived. Henry ran Dawson and Associates, a small property development company, a slightly grandiose name for a three-person operation, but grandiosity was very much on brand. 6 years of operation, moderate success, a portfolio that looked respectable on paper. On paper. That phrase was about to become very important, because when Elena, with her background in financial analysis and her specific talent for following a thread through numbers until she found where it went somewhere it shouldn't, started looking at Dawson and Associates with real attention, she found things that didn't add up. Not obviously, not in the way that screams fraud on first glance, but in the subtle, careful way that told Elena someone had been very deliberate about making things look cleaner than they were. She started pulling on the thread. It began with the company's financing records. Elena had a contact, a former colleague named Diane, who now worked at a financial due diligence firm and owed her more than one professional favor. She called Diane on a Thursday evening and asked, casually, for a look at anything publicly available on Dawson and Associates. Diane came back within 48 hours with documents that made Elena sit very still at her kitchen table for a long time. The property developments that formed the visible face of Henry's company were real. The buildings existed. The sales had happened. But underneath the legitimate business, running parallel to it in a way that required real attention to notice, was a secondary set of financial flows that didn't connect to any legitimate activity Elena could identify. Money was coming in from sources listed as consulting revenue and advisory fees, descriptions so deliberately vague as to be almost parody. It was flowing through Dawson and Associates and coming out the other side as legitimate income, which had a name that Elena knew well and that explained, at least in part, how Henry had maintained a lifestyle significantly more comfortable than a three-person property company should have been able to support. She sat back and let the implications land. Henry wasn't just a man who had manipulated a will. Henry was a man who had been quietly running money through his company for years, which meant there were other people involved, which meant there were other people who had something to lose, which meant Henry's position, which he had probably believed was impregnable, backed by money and charm and a freshly inherited estate, was actually a great deal more fragile than he knew. She updated her spreadsheet. She opened a new column. She titled it Leverage. But before we go further into the plan, we need to talk about the family. Because this story is not just about Elena and Henry. It's about the people who exist in the space between them, who love them both in varying degrees and complicated ways, and who are about to be forced to choose. Their mother, Carol, was the first person Elena called after leaving the lawyer's office. The conversation was short and carefully neutral. Carol said she was sorry Elena was upset, said she was sure Robert had had his reasons, said it would be best for everyone if Elena took some time. She did not say the will was wrong. She did not say Henry should have done things differently. And in that absence, in the space between what Carol said and what she didn't say, Elena heard something she had been half suspecting for years and had never allowed herself to fully name. Carol knew. Not necessarily the full extent, not the money laundering, but the will. Carol Dawson had known this was coming, and she had said nothing, and in saying nothing, she had chosen. That realization was, in some ways, more painful than the will itself. Aunt Patricia called 2 days after the reading and said in her direct and unvarnished way that the whole thing stank to high heaven. Patricia had never liked Henry, but the call told Elena something useful. There were allies in this family. Marcus, 36, who had been close with Henry before something happened between them that left a permanent coolness, texted simply, "Heard about the will." That's not right. 3 words of subtext in 7 words of text, and Elena read all 3 clearly. She was not as alone as Henry had calculated. Good. She would need that. On the 8th day, Henry called her. She had been expecting this. She let it go to voicemail the first time, let him compose the version he wanted to deliver. Then she called him back. "Elena." His voice was warm. Warm the way a fireplace is warm when you're cold, entirely seductive if you don't know the fireplace is the source of a slow gas leak. "Henry," she said, "I've been thinking about you. I know the will was a shock. I want you to know that I intend to—" "Henry," she said, cutting the warmth off cleanly, "I'm not calling to have this conversation. I just want to ask you one question." A pause, small, barely audible, but she caught it. "How long were you planning this?" The silence this time was longer. When he spoke again, the warmth was still there. He was too good for it not to be. But underneath it, something had shifted. Something had become, by the smallest margin, more careful. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "I think you do," Elena said, "but that's okay. You don't have to answer. I just wanted you to know that I know." She hung up. She sat back and felt something she hadn't felt in 9 days, something that was almost, in a dark and complicated way, something close to power. Then she went back to her spreadsheet. The private investigator's report arrived on a Friday afternoon in a plain email with 3 attachments. Elena read it at her kitchen table, with a cup of tea she forgot to drink over the course of 2 hours. She read it once quickly, then went back and read the significant sections again, the way she read financial documents when the numbers were telling her something important and she needed to understand exactly what. The headline finding, Dawson and Associates had for the last 4 years been used as a conduit for funds from 2 sources. The first was Garrett Walsh, which Elena had already identified. The second was more surprising. The second source was connected through 2 intermediary entities to a man named Vincent Chow, a property developer, significantly larger scale than Henry, operating in upper-tier commercial real estate, with a reputation for aggressive deal-making and a portfolio that had attracted, at various points, the quiet attention of financial regulators. Nothing had ever stuck, but the attention had been there. Henry was not just laundering money for Garrett Walsh. Henry was a small but functional piece of a significantly larger operation. The clean-looking middle layer, a legitimate property developer with a respectable enough profile to receive and redistribute funds without triggering scrutiny. And here was the detail that made Elena set down her tea and stare at the wall for 3 full minutes. The timing. The escalation in funds flowing through Dawson and Associates had increased significantly in the 18 months before their father's death, which was also, she sat very still, connecting the threads, the period during which Henry had become significantly more involved in managing their father's affairs. More visits, more time with Robert Dawson, more influence over his decisions, which meant Henry had not just manipulated a will, Henry had potentially manipulated his own father over an extended period of time, cultivating access and influence while using the family's legitimate name as protective coloring for a financial operation that had nothing to do with family and everything to do with Henry's own interests. He had not just stolen from Elena. He had, in a very real sense, used their dying father. Elena did not cry often, not because she was emotionally cold. She was, in private, deeply feeling in ways she rarely showed anyone, but because she had spent so many years in a family where being the steady one was her role that the habit of containing her emotions in moments of crisis had become almost automatic. She cried now. Not for long, not in a collapsing, consuming way, more like a controlled release. 10 minutes, alone in her kitchen, with no witnesses and no performance required. She let herself feel the full weight of what she was looking at. Not just the theft, not just the manipulation, but the scale of it, the patience of it. The fact that this had been happening, quietly, for years, while she had been managing her father's doctors and making his meals and sitting in hospital waiting rooms, believing that the family she was holding together was something real. It was real. It had just also, simultaneously, been a resource Henry was exploiting. She wiped her face. She made a fresh cup of tea. She went back to the spreadsheet. She had enough, she now believed, to go to authorities. The financial evidence, Marcus's testimony about Henry's approach to him, the PY's report connecting Dawson and Associates to Walsh and Chow. A forensic accountant could do significant work with this material. But And this was the but that would define the next chapter of the story. Elena was not ready for authorities yet. Because authorities moved slowly, they required evidence to meet specific thresholds. They had processes and timelines and outcomes that were not within Elena's control. And in the time it would take for any official process to move, Henry would still be living in the family home, still drawing on the inherited assets, still operating Dawson and Associates. Elena wanted more than eventual justice through a process she couldn't control. She wanted to be the one who took it, and that was the moment. Sitting at her kitchen table on a Friday evening with a PI's report in front of her and a spreadsheet full of information and a grief that had quietly turned into something harder and sharper. That was the moment Elena Dawson crossed the line between justice and revenge. She didn't hear it happen. It didn't make a sound, but it happened, and everything that came after came from that moment. She started with Henry's reputation, Henry's entire operation, both the legitimate face of Dawson and Associates and the significantly less legitimate activity underneath it, depended on relationships, on trust, on the professional and social credibility he had spent years building through exactly the kind of charm and attentiveness that Elena had always understood was not organic, but engineered. If those relationships frayed, if the people who trusted Henry began to have questions, to hear things, to look at him with the slight uncertainty that doubt introduces, the entire structure became less stable. Elena was very careful about how she did this. She was a financial analyst. She understood defamation law. She was not going to say anything false. She was going to say things that were true, documented, supportable, in the right ears. The right ears were two of Henry's significant professional contacts. A property developer named Stanton, who had partnered with Henry on 2 projects, and a commercial lender named Forsyth, whose institution had provided financing for Henry's most recent development. Elena didn't call these people directly. She was not that crude. Instead, she wrote a letter, carefully, legally, documented, to the compliance department of Forsyth's lending institution, raising questions about the due diligence performed on Dawson and Associates, and specifically requesting a review of certain revenue streams represented in Henry's financing applications. She attached 3 documents from the PI's report, only sections that met the threshold of documentable fact, nothing speculative, and signed it with her full name and professional credentials. A compliance department receiving a letter like that from someone with those credentials did not ignore it. She then attended an industry networking event specifically because she knew Stanton would be there. They fell into conversation in the organic, unforced way that happens when one person has prepared carefully. She mentioned, in the vague, tentative way of someone sharing a concern rather than making an accusation, that she'd heard some questions being raised about the sourcing of funds in some of Dawson and Associates' recent projects. Stanton's face didn't change much, but his posture shifted. "What kind of questions?" he asked. "I don't know the details," Elena said. "Someone in compliance mentioned it to me. I might be completely wrong." She was not completely wrong, but the doubt was now planted, and Stanton, she knew, would do his own due diligence before agreeing to the next project Henry had been proposing to him. She moved to the family home next. This was the part that took the most out of her, not strategically, but going back to the house she had grown up in, now technically owned by Henry, required a kind of deliberate compartmentalization that cost her more than anything else she had done so far. She called her mother. The relationship between Elena and Carol had been, since the will reading, suspended in a careful politeness that suited neither of them. Carol called occasionally with a slightly searching quality, monitoring the temperature of Elena's state without being willing to discuss the source of the heat. Elena called and asked to come over. Carol said yes immediately. The house looked the same. It always looked the same. Carol was a meticulous keeper of spaces. Elena sat at the kitchen table where she had sat her whole childhood, drinking tea from the same ceramic mugs, and looked at her mother and asked her directly, "Did you know what was in the will before he died?" Carol wrapped both hands around her mug. She looked at the table, then at Elena. "Your father made his own decisions," she said, which was not a no. "Did you know?" Elena asked again. Carol's face did something complicated and painful. "I knew your father wanted Henry to have the business," she said finally. "I thought there would be more for you as well. When there wasn't, I was surprised too." "But you didn't warn me," Elena said, "before the reading." Carol said nothing. Elena looked at her mother. She looked at the face she had known her entire life, the face currently doing everything it could to avoid holding her gaze, and she felt something that was not anger. Anger she could have worked with. This was sadder than anger. This was the particular grief of understanding someone clearly and completely and not being able to stop loving them even in the understanding. "I'm going to tell you some things," Elena said, "about Henry, about what he's been doing." Carol's hands tightened around her mug. "I'm not sure I want to know," she said. "I know," Elena said, "but I'm going to tell you anyway, because you're going to find out eventually, and I'd rather you hear it from me." She told her mother. Not everything, not the forensic detail, but enough. Enough for Carol to understand that the charming, beloved younger son, who had positioned himself as the natural heir, had been, quietly and for years, doing things the family home should never have been connected to. Carol listened without speaking. When Elena finished, she sat in silence for a long time. "What are you going to do?" Carol asked finally. "I'm going to take it apart," Elena said. "All of it, everything he built." Carol looked at her daughter. And what Elena saw was not the resistance she had steeled herself for, not a defense of Henry or a plea for family unity or any of the things she had anticipated. It was something that looked almost like relief. 3 weeks after the conversation with her mother, Elena went to see Garrett Walsh. This was, in retrospect, the moment the story shifted from cold strategy into something rawer and more dangerous. Everything before had been careful, measured. Going to see Walsh was different. Going to see Walsh was personal. She had debated it for 4 days, had asked herself whether this was a necessary move or a satisfying one. There is a difference between those two things, and Elena knew it. And knowing it was precisely what made this decision so telling. It was both. Walsh's offices were in a commercial park, modest by the standards of what his financial activities suggested he could afford. A man who processed that kind of money, choosing to operate from a mid-tier commercial park, was a man who had made deliberate choices about visibility. Elena arrived without an appointment. Walsh came out 6 minutes later, mid-40s, compact and careful-looking, with a face that gave away very little. "Ms. Dawson," he said. He already knew who she was. They sat in a small meeting room. He did not offer her coffee. "I'm going to be direct," she said. "I know about the arrangement you have with my brother. I know the nature of it. I have documentation." "I'm not sure what arrangement you're referring to." "I'm sure you're not," she said pleasantly. "I'm not a regulator, not a lawyer, not here to make threats. I'm here because my brother stole something from me, and the mechanism he used is connected to your work with him. And I want you to understand that the attention I'm paying to Dawson and Associates is going to eventually reach a level where other people start paying it too, people with significantly more formal authority than I have." Something behind his eyes shifted, the specific recalibration of rapid threat assessment. "What do you want?" he asked. "Nothing from you," she said. "I'm just making sure that when those people with formal authority start asking questions, and they will, they're not surprised by the answers, and that anyone who might want to get ahead of those questions has sufficient time to consider their options." She stood up, held out her hand. Walsh looked at it, then shook it. She sat in her car for 6 minutes afterward, shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the adrenaline of having been in the room with that particular kind of danger and having managed it. 3 days later, the PI told her that Walsh had abruptly canceled 2 upcoming meetings with Henry. She updated the spreadsheet. Henry called her that evening. The warmth in his voice was gone. Not entirely. He was too practiced for it to vanish completely, but the temperature had dropped. There was a quality she had only heard very occasionally growing up, in moments when someone had pushed Henry far enough that maintaining the performance required real effort. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he said. "I don't know what you mean," Elena said, her own voice perfectly level. "Walsh called me." "Did he?" "Elena." The warmth was definitely gone now. "I understand you're upset about the will." "Henry," she said, "I'm not going to have this conversation on the phone. If you want to talk, come and see me, or don't. But if you don't, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. And I think we both know the current direction of travel is not good for you." She hung up. She waited to see what he would do. He came. 2 days later, on a Tuesday evening, Henry Dawson rang the buzzer of his sister's apartment for the first time in over 2 years. Elena buzzed him in. She heard his footsteps on the stairs. The specific rhythm of them, somehow unchanged from childhood, recognizable in the way that everything about a sibling is recognizable beneath whatever they've built on top of it. She opened the door before he knocked. He looked less polished than she was used to. The charm was still there, structural by now, built into the way he moved, but underneath it something was tight, something that read, if you knew how to look, as worry. He came in. She poured 2 glasses of water. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had started the spreadsheet, read the PI's report, cried for 10 minutes and gotten back to work. They looked at each other. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked. Henry was quiet. And in that moment, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time, the actual face beneath the performance. Her brother as he actually was, as opposed to the character he usually ran on top of it. "Dad was going to split it," Henry said. "Originally, half and half." Elena went very still. "I found out about 8 months before he died," Henry said. "He told me. I don't know why. Maybe he wanted to see how I'd react. Maybe he thought I'd be fine with it." He paused. "I wasn't fine with it." "So you changed his mind?" Elena said. "I talked to him," Henry said. "Over months. I pointed out things. About the business. About what it would take to maintain the estate properly. About how it made sense to consolidate rather than divide." "You gaslit your dying father," Elena said. "I talked to him," Henry repeated, and the defensiveness in it told her she wasn't entirely wrong. "And Walsh? The money? Chow?" Henry's jaw tightened. "That has nothing to do with—" "It has everything to do with this," Elena said. "You've been using the Dawson name, using this family's reputation as cover, and Dad never knew what he was protecting." Henry was quiet. "I want half the portfolio," Elena said. "What was mine before you decided it shouldn't be. That's not—" "And I want you to disentangle yourself from Walsh and Chow," she said. "Cleanly, verifiably. Because if you don't, the file I have goes to people who will do it for you in a way that is significantly less comfortable." Henry looked at her across the table. The performance had dropped entirely. This was just her brother, her actual brother, the one she had grown up with, the one she had once loved without complication before the complications arrived, looking at something he had not anticipated. "You'd really do it," he said. Not quite a question. "Yes," she said simply. He left without agreeing to anything, but he left differently than he arrived. Because here is the truth about revenge that no one talks about. The fantasies of it feel like clarity, like finally, after all the helplessness of being hurt, you have agency, you have direction, you have something to do with the anger instead of just carrying it, but the reality is messier, because the person you're dismantling is not a stranger. The person you're dismantling is your brother. And regardless of what he did, regardless of how completely and deliberately he betrayed you, he is still the person who was in the back seat on every family road trip, who you shared a childhood with, whose face you know better than almost anyone else's. Elena was winning. By almost any measurable standard, she was winning. And she felt terrible. That is not the end of the story. But it is, I think, the most honest part of it. The family meeting happened 12 days later. It was Carol who called it, which surprised Elena, and she suspected surprised Henry even more. Carol was not a woman who called meetings. The fact that she picked up the phone and called both her children and Aunt Patricia and told them she needed them all in the family home on Saturday afternoon was an act of will that had cost her mother significantly. Elena drove to the family home on a gray Saturday. She parked in the driveway she had parked in her whole life and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house, the bay windows, the rose bush by the front door her father had planted 20 years ago, the specific arrangement of ordinary domestic things that had constituted her entire understanding of home for the first 18 years of her existence. Henry's car was already there. Aunt Patricia's was in the street. She went inside. Patricia on the sofa with her coat still on. For Patricia, a power move. Henry by the window with a coffee he wasn't drinking, the warmth turned down to its lowest viable setting. Carol at the kitchen counter doing something that didn't need doing because she needed to be in motion. Elena sat down. Carol turned around. "I asked you all here," Carol said, "because this family is tearing itself apart and I am not going to sit by while it happens." No one spoke. "Henry." Carol's voice was steady in the way of someone who has rehearsed this. "I know what you did. Elena told me. I've had 3 weeks to decide whether I believed it, and I do. What you did was not okay. Your father's money, the way it was arranged, none of that was right. And whatever else you've been involved in," she stopped, gathering the specific courage the next part required, "that's going to have consequences. You know that." Henry was very still. "But I am not going to watch my children destroy each other." She turned to Elena. "And what you've been doing, Elena, some of it maybe, but you've gone further than—" "He stole my inheritance, Mum," Elena said. "I know," Carol said. "I'm not excusing it. I'm asking whether what you've been doing since is actually about getting back what's yours, or whether it's become about something else." The room was quiet. Patricia from the sofa said, "She's right. About both of you." Henry looked at Elena. Elena looked at Henry. And in that look, across the kitchen table in the house where they had both grown up, in front of the mother who had somehow managed to love them both through everything and continued to do so, something shifted. Not resolution, not forgiveness, not any easy restoration of what had been, but something, a recognition. The specific and uncomfortable recognition that comes when you have been in a fight long enough that you stop seeing the other person as an opponent and start seeing them again as a person, flawed, afraid, doing damage, not irreducible to those things, but not separable from them either. Henry put down his coffee. "What do you actually want?" he asked, his voice quieter than she had heard it in weeks. "Half," she said. "What was mine?" "The house?" "Not the house," she said, after a pause that surprised her. "Mum's in the house, the portfolio, the accounts, half." Henry looked at his mother, at Patricia, back at Elena. "And the rest?" "The rest is your problem," she said. "Walsh, Chow, however you resolve it. But you need to resolve it, because the file doesn't disappear because we reach an agreement. It exists. Other people have copies. If you keep going, eventually those people don't need me to tell them where to look." Henry was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. It was not warm. It was not a restoration of sibling trust or family harmony. It was an agreement between two people who understood each other's leverage and had made a calculation about what was survivable. It was, Elena thought, the most honest thing that had passed between them in years. The legal process took 4 months. Gerald Park drew up the revised arrangement, not a contested probate, which would have been long and expensive and public, but a negotiated settlement between the two beneficiaries that redistributed the estate more in line with what Robert Dawson had apparently intended before Henry's months of persuasion had reshaped his intentions. Elena took a portfolio of investments and cash representing approximately half the estate value. Henry retained the family home, in trust for Carol's use during her lifetime, and the remaining half. Dawson and Associates was wound down. Elena never received a full accounting of how the Walsh and Chow connections were resolved. She had decided, deliberately and with some effort, that she did not need to know. What she needed was for the Dawson name to no longer be attached to whatever that was. She gave Marcus a bottle of wine and a handwritten note. He texted back, "You did good. Be careful with yourself." Aunt Patricia said without preamble, "Well, you got what you deserved. Whether the getting was worth the cost, you'll have to decide." She sat with that for a while. Let's talk about the cost. Elena got half the inheritance, what was rightfully hers, by the standard of what her father had apparently intended before Henry got to him. She exposed genuine corruption. She forced a reckoning. By any external accounting, she was not a person who had done wrong. And yet, she had used information as a weapon. She had visited a man who operated in genuinely dangerous territory and made a veiled threat. She had deliberately planted doubt about her brother in a professional context where that doubt could cause real damage beyond what was strictly necessary for her actual goal. She had looked at each of those choices and made them anyway, and while making them, she had told herself they were justified, that the cause was sufficient, that the ends were clean enough to absorb the means. But the person you are at the end of a revenge is not the same person you were at the beginning. You change in the process, not dramatically, not irreversibly, but you find out what you're capable of, and that knowledge does not go back into the box once it comes out. She moved apartments. Not out of necessity, out of a need to start from a different physical point. The new place had more light, a longer commute, a coffee shop downstairs with a menu that took itself slightly too seriously. Small pleasures. She was learning to notice them. She called her mother every Sunday. Still slightly careful, not quite returned to what they'd been before, but warm, genuine. Carol was slowly beginning to process what had happened with an honesty she had apparently spent a long time avoiding. Neither of them was there yet, but they were calling each other on Sundays, which was something. Henry she did not call. Henry did not call her. There might come a time for that conversation. She was not ready for it yet. She kept the notes app entry on her phone. "I am taking everything." She had not deleted it. She looked at it occasionally, not obsessively, just sometimes. A record of who she had been in that moment on the October pavement. The specific person she had been in that moment of grief and fury. She had done it. She had taken it. And the thing about having done it was that it had not produced what she expected. The satisfaction was real, but thinner than she'd imagined. The justice felt genuine, but complicated by everything that had gone into achieving it. She was free of it. Mostly. Or becoming free. Slowly. That was, she thought, the most honest thing she could say. 6 months after the settlement, Elena went to her father's grave. She went on a Wednesday morning in April. The cemetery was quiet. She brought flowers, not white lilies, which she had seen enough of, but something simpler, yellow and uncomplicated. She stood there for a while without saying anything. She thought about her father as she had known him, not as the man whose will had defined the last several months of her life, but as the actual person. His laugh. His habit of reading 3 books simultaneously and losing track of which plot belonged to which. The way he had always called her reliable, which she had taken as a compliment and had only recently begun to understand was more ambivalent than he meant. Being called reliable is not the same as being called loved. Robert Dawson had loved Elena, she believed that, but being relied upon had sometimes substituted for other things. Being the steady one had meant, in the family's economy, being the one they didn't worry about. The one who could be taken for granted because she was always there. Henry had been the one they worried about, and in some families, the one who takes the most is read as the one who needs the most, which gets read as the one who loves the most, which gets read as the most loved. None of that was right, but she could see how it had happened. She put the flowers down. Then she went home. She made tea. She opened her laptop. She had work to do. Here is the question this story leaves me with, and I'm asking it to you directly because I want to hear what you think. Elena got justice. Let's call it that. She got what was hers. She exposed something corrupt. She forced a reckoning. By the standard of outcomes, she won. But she won by becoming, for a period of time, someone who used information as a weapon, who made deliberate moves to cause professional and personal damage, who chose the satisfaction of being the one to take it apart over the cleaner but slower route of letting official processes handle it. Was she right? Is revenge ever really justice? Or is it justice with a cost we don't always acknowledge until we're standing on the other side of it? I genuinely want to know what you think. Drop it in the comments. This story doesn't have a clean answer, and I think that's exactly the point. Would you have done the same thing? Step by step, choice by choice, at what point, if any, would you have stopped? Was there a move Elena made that you would not have made? Or do you think she didn't go far enough? Tell me. And if this story hit you somewhere real, if something about Elena's journey, or the family dynamics, or the specific pain of being betrayed by the person who was supposed to be on your side resonated with you, I would love to hear that too. That's what this community is for. If you're new here and this was your first video, welcome. Genuinely, subscribe and hit the bell. Next week's story has a twist I promise you are not expecting, and I would hate for you to miss it. Take care of yourselves. And remember, being reliable doesn't mean being expendable. Know your worth. Hold on to it. We'll see you next week.